In July 2019, 20 soldiers from an elite Mexican unit were dispatched into the rugged, unforgiving hills of Guanovado. On paper, their orders were deceptively simple. Find hidden marijuana plantations, destroy them, return to base. This was routine, or at least it was supposed to be. Across Mexico, these small specialized detachments are used like surgical tools, sweeping through the dense forests, jagged mountains, and secluded valleys where the cartels hide their billion-dollar crops. The men of this unit were veterans. They were hard-bitten. They understood the rules of this shadow war. They knew the risks by heart. Cartel scouts, known as halcones or falcons, could be perched on any ridge, watching their every move through binoculars. Ambushes were a constant, lethal possibility. A booby trap, a sniper's nest, a wrong turn in this disorienting terrain. Any of it could mean never coming back. Still, it was a job. It was what they were trained for. They moved in tactical silence, a staggered file of green camouflage against the brown, dry soil. Rifles were held at the low ready. Boots crunched softly over loose stones. The air was thick with heat, and the weight of their packs, body armor, and ammunition was a familiar burden. Radios sputtered with clipped commands, then, one by one, cut out as the ridges grew taller, swallowing the signal. The forest seemed to absorb sound the way a cave swallows light. It was an oppressive, heavy quiet. Some of the men tried to keep the mood light. You have to, in places like this. One soldier, a new father, carried a worn, laminated photo of his wife and daughter. He'd shown it to the man next to him just that morning, tapping the plastic. Be home in less than a week. He'd promised, more to himself than anyone else. Another soldier, a man who had seen too many of these patrols, joked about the rations. He called the packaged beans grenades for the stomach. The laughter was short. It was nervous. It didn't echo. Out here, nerves didn't last long. The land itself seemed to bleach them away. By nightfall, they had made camp near a dry creek bed. The setup was standard procedure, drilled into them until it was muscle memory. Tents were kept low to the ground. A discreet perimeter was marked. Guards were posted in rotating shifts. Everything was by the book. The commanding officer, a man respected for his calm, reminded them this was a simple job. In and out, he said, his voice low. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. But the land itself, the land seemed to disagree. As the last light bled from the sky, the forest turned unnaturally quiet, not just quiet. Silent. No birdsong, no crickets, not even the rustle of wind in the high trees. The silence pressed in on them, thick and heavy, like a physical weight. The men settled into their sleeping bags, rifles close enough to touch. The air grew cold. Then, sometime after midnight, it began. From deep in the forest, from a direction no one could pinpoint, came the first wail. It was a long, drawn-out cry that didn't sound like any animal they knew. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a jaguar. Some swore it was human, like the sound of someone being tortured, a sound of pure agony. Others shook their heads, their faces pale in the faint starlight. The pitch was too low, too guttural. It wasn't human at all. The sound cut off, leaving only the sound of their own hearts pounding in their chests. Minutes dragged by. A guard clicked his safety off, then on again. Then it came again, closer this time. The mission was supposed to be about crops, cartels, and hidden fields. But by the end of that first night, the soldiers already knew. They were not alone, and whatever else lived in those hills, it had no intention of letting them leave quietly. Morning should have broken the tension. It didn't. It only exposed how wrong everything felt. The sun came up pale and thin, as if it lacked warmth. It painted the hills in weak shades of gray and brown. The men marched in silence, the creak of their pack straps and the scuff of their boots the only sounds. Something was profoundly wrong with the forest. A single man noticing it could be dismissed as nerves, but all 20 of them felt it. No calls, no wings in the air, no scurrying in the brush. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the leaves on the trees perfectly still. This wasn't the peace of nature. It was the absence of it. It was a vacuum. The radio operator tried again, his thumb pressing the cracked handset. Sex, radio hum. A faint hum came through like a signal fighting to be born, a brief, tantalizing promise of contact. The men slowed, waiting, a flicker of hope in their eyes. Then the sound thinned, stretched into a high-pitched whine, and vanished. The operator cursed under his breath and wrote the hour in his log. 9, sir. Signal failure. There was nothing more to say. They followed a narrow path that twisted through the ridges. Dry leaves snapped under their boots, but the sound carried no echo. Each sound seemed to fall dead at their feet, absorbed by the thirsty ground and the silent trees. A young soldier, barely 19, whispered to the man in front of him. The forest. It's listening. No one corrected him. No one laughed. By midday, they found old signs of passage. These were the tracks they were looking for. Cartel trails. Faint ruts from mules carrying supplies. But the tracks ended abruptly, as if the operation had been abandoned in a hurry. Erased. The officer ordered them forward, faster now. He was eager to finish the sweep, to find the crop, and to reach the extraction point. The unease was growing, and finishing the mission was the only way out. The hills grew jagged. Stone, black and sharp, pushed out of the soil like broken ribs. The path wound past dark mouths in the rock. Caves. At first, they were small and low, little more than animal dens. But as they climbed higher, the caves grew larger, yawning black openings in the cliff faces. Some of the men turned their helmet-mounted lights briefly inside as they passed. The powerful beams were swallowed after only a few feet. A cool air drifted from the openings, and it carried the same metallic, coppery tang they had smelled the night before. The officer gave the signal to keep moving. "No detours," he barked. "No curiosity." But each man felt it. The caves marked the land like scars, and the air around them seemed heavier, colder. The column marched on, boots steady, rifles tight. No one spoke. The caves stayed behind them, watching, uncounted. By evening, when they finally set camp for the second night, no one mentioned the silence anymore. It wasn't something to describe. It was something they were inside of, as if the forest itself had chosen not to speak until it was ready. And ahead, though they couldn't see it yet, the largest cave of all was waiting. By the third day, their luck finally turned, or so it seemed. The trail bent through a deep ravine, and there it was. Small pumps hummed low, feeding a spiderweb of plastic hoses that vanished into the soil. It was exactly what they'd come for. The officer gave the order, and the work began. The tension of the last 48 hours dissolved into the familiar rhythm of labor. Machetes cut the thick stalks. Rucksacks of gear came off shoulders. Small explosive charges were set in the irrigation system and on the pumps. Within an hour, the entire crop was nothing but broken, wilting stems. By noon, fire rolled across the clearing. Black, oily smoke curled into the sky, so thick it seemed to blot out the sun before it disappeared into the higher ridges. The men stood back, rifles slung, sweat running down their faces, the heat of the blaze pushing them back. For the first time in days, shoulders eased. The job was done. "Couple more days and it's showers and cold beer," one soldier said, kicking at a smoldering stump. Another smirked, wiping his face on his sleeve, and no more grenades for the stomach beans. The laughter was short, but it was real this time. It was a release, a pressure valve for the fear they had been holding in since the first scream. But what happened next would change everything. The officer wasn't about to risk the obvious trail home. Cartel spotters, drawn by the massive column of smoke, could already be moving to intercept them. He ordered an alternate extraction route, one less predictable. The map traced it through broken hills and unfamiliar ground. It was safer from ambush, but riskier in terrain. By late afternoon, they were moving again. The forest closed in around them, the paths narrowing into stone gullies. And here and there, the cave mouths opened along the slopes. Some were no larger than crawl spaces. Others were wide enough to walk through without stooping. The men kept their eyes forward. But they felt the air change when they passed the larger ones. It was cooler there, carrying a trace of moisture, and the faint, iron scent they all remembered from the night cries. It was the kind of air that seemed to come from deeper than the earth itself. No one said anything, but each man felt it. The caves weren't just holes in the rock. They were thresholds, the kind you didn't cross unless you had to. The unit pressed on, dust rising under their boots, the smell of smoke still clinging to their gear. The plantation was behind them. The caves were waiting ahead. They picked the largest mouth. It was a strategic decision, born of exhaustion and a need for defense. The sun was setting, and another night in the open, with those sounds, was unthinkable. They moved in with the economy of men who had learned how to make shelter from rock and shadow. Stone offered 3 walls and a ceiling. It kept wind in sight from 3 directions. In a bad place, a cave is a shelter. In a worse place, it's a trap. The officer decided the trade was worth it. Everything that followed was efficient and familiar. Men set low-profile shelters against the stone, just inside the mouth. Sleeping bags were rolled out. Tripwires, strung with small, silent bells, were stretched across the narrow approach path. A simple early warning, just in case. 2 men stacked loose stones to create a short barricade near the opening. It was nothing fancy, only enough to slow someone down long enough to get off a clean shot. The medic arranged his bag near a wall where a slow drip of water wouldn't reach it. The radio operator climbed a low ledge, checked his dials again, and scribbled in his log. 19, MIT. Intermittent signal. We'll try hourly. The perimeter plan was taped to a flat rock and marked with a grease pencil. A rotation schedule. 4 men awake at all times. 2 inside, near the entrance. 2 outside, watching the approaches. The routine steadied them. It always does. Training is designed for that. It turns fear into motion. Check your magazines, cover your sector, run the tally, keep your shoulders square. For a few hours it worked. Men ate their rations quietly, their voices low, absorbed by the stone. Someone tried to joke again, this time about the sudden damp cold. The laugh died fast, swallowed by the cave. Night settled like a lid. The cave held the small sounds of their camp and made them familiar. The scrape of a zipper, the clink of a canteen, the soft, rhythmic breathing of men who had been taught how to wait. Flashlights were kept low. Red lenses were fitted over the lamps, a dim glow that wouldn't ruin their night vision or give away their position. A pair of men took the first watch while the rest attempted sleep in fits and starts, rifles resting on their chests. At 03 sorts, the guards heard it. It didn't come from the trees this time. It didn't come from the hills. It rose from inside the cave. It came from somewhere deeper than the shallow chamber where they had set up. The sound rolled out like a giant, ragged breath dragged across stone. It was long, broken, and fundamentally wrong. It bent and echoed off the unseen walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Every man was awake in a heartbeat. Rifles slapped into hands. Safety catches clicked. Flashlights slammed to full white beam intensity, cutting the darkness. The officer's voice cut through the sudden rush of adrenaline. Hold positions. Light discipline. Report. A man fumbled with his radio handset, his hands shaking, and cursed when the dial only hissed and died. The scream came again. Closer now. Not traveling from a distance, but erupting from a throat somewhere deeper in the rock. It carried a shape. This wasn't the raw, high pitch of a frightened human, nor the thin keening of a wounded animal. It was thick, guttural, and it was threaded with a low-frequency note that made their teeth ache. The medic squeezed his eyes shut for a second, as if the sound could be stopped that way. The men exchanged looks that needed no translation. They were trained to clear rooms, to root out hidden enemies and bunkers. They were not trained for whatever made that sound. The options were simple, and they were ugly. Option 1. Pull up camp and move out blindly through the dark hills. Risk walking into a cartel ambush or losing men to the treacherous black footing. Option 2. Press inward. Go into the place the noise came from and face whatever lived in the dark head on. Either choice could get them all killed. The officer made his call. It was quick. Split the unit. Half of you hold the mouth, the other half with me. We clear. The words landed like a blade. Half the men were to form a hard defensive ring, barrels braced, lights low, ears open. Their orders were to prevent anything from pouring out while the others went deeper. The other half fitted bayonets to their rifles. They mounted flashlights on their weapon rails, and they followed the officer into the tunnel. Those who stayed tightened their makeshift barricade. They crouched behind the low wall of stones, fingers resting on triggers, eyes fixed on the black throat of the cave. They listened, not just for the scream, but for the sound of their brothers, for steps coming back, for a shout, for the familiar, muffled rhythm of a comrade's voice. Every sound that was not theirs set their hearts pounding a little higher. The explorers moved like a blade cuts. 2 forward men, 2 covering behind them. Their light beams cut narrow, bouncing cones through the dark. Their boots made little noise on the wet stone. Water dripped, a steady plink, plink. The deeper they went, the smaller the world became. No sky, no landmarks. Only the arc of their light and the rock around it. Breath fogged under their helmets. Every shadow seemed to twitch. Inside, the air tasted of old metal and cold. The radio operator's log, recovered later, had a single final line. 0307. Noise from interior. Splitting unit. That was the last thing written before the first shot cried out. It would change everything. Back at the mouth, the men waited with the kind of patience that rots your nerves from the inside out. They watched the entrance like eyes on a clock, a countdown they couldn't stop. The tiny bells on the tripwire tinkled once as a breeze moved through. No one moved. Then, deep inside, the sound rose again. Closer, sharper. And this time, it carried movement with it. Something was answering the light. The deeper they pressed, the less the cave seemed like inert stone. It felt more like a living throat, swallowing them step by step. The beams of their flashlights swung in nervous, narrow arcs. They caught the glint of water dripping from cracks in the ceiling, the shine of mineral veins, the smooth, worn ribs of rock. Each circle of light was small, and it faded fast, leaving an oppressive, absolute blackness pressed in on every side. The officer moved at the front, his rifle high, his light steady. He was the anchor. Behind him, boots scuffed on stone, each sound magnified, echoing off the walls until it felt like 100 men were moving instead of just 8. No one spoke. The air was colder here, heavy with the same faint copper tang they had smelled on the second night. It clung to their tongues, made their throats dry. At first, there was nothing. Just the echoes of their own movement. The tension almost broke into relief. Maybe it was nothing. Just acoustics. Just the cave itself groaning under the weight of the mountain. But then a beam. A single beam from the point man, slid across something that wasn't rock. Hold. The officer's hiss was sharp. The light steadied. It was a patch of greenish-black surface. It was slick, and it was ridged. The soldier's hand trembled on the flashlight. At first, it looked like moss, or a sheet of wet rubber, until the ridges shifted. They were scales, layered like armor. The shape curved upward, then out, ending in a hand with long clawed fingers that were dug into the stone wall. The rest of it pulled free from the rock. Eyes caught the light, reflecting it back in a dull, oily shine. They were larger than human eyes, and they were black. Black from edge to edge. No whites, no iris. The jaw was long, lined with sharp, needle-like teeth that glistened with saliva. The head tilted, studying them, not with panic, not with fear, but with the cold, patient curiosity of a predator. Then 2 more shapes uncoiled from the walls. They had been there all along, pressed into the stone, their texture so similar to the rock that they were impossible to distinguish, until they moved. Scaled bodies, as tall as men but built with a dense, wrong-looking musculature. Their limbs bent with an unnatural, spidery speed. One hunched low to the ground, its claws scraping the stone. Another swung along the wall, climbing sideways, as if gravity were just an afterthought. For a few, heart-stopping seconds, both sides just stared. The soldiers, frozen in disbelief. The creatures, waiting. Then, one of them opened its mouth. The scream that poured out wasn't just sound, it was pressure. It vibrated through their chests, rattled their teeth, and bounced off the rock until it felt like the whole cave was wailing with it. Training snapped. It broke. The first shot cracked like thunder. SFX, loud, echoing gunfire. Muzzle flash lit the chamber in blinding white bursts. Bullets hammered into the scaled chests, heads, and limbs. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted, whining off the stone, snapping back into the dark. The creatures barely flinched. One took a 5.56mm round full in the face. It staggered, blinked once, and hissed. The bullet had flattened, sliding off its dense hide like water. The men fired harder, a desperate, panicked barrage. Casings rattled across the ground. The narrow chamber filled with smoke and the smell of cordite, but the creatures came anyway. The first soldier to fall was yanked off his feet so fast he barely had time to scream. Claws, black and curved, punched into his shoulder and pulled him into the dark. His rifle clattered against the stone. A wet, sickening snap followed. Then silence. Another soldier tried to hold his position. He braced against the wall, fired short, controlled bursts, and shouted for the others to move. A blur swept in, low to the ground. The creature's claw raked across his midsection, and he folded where he stood, blood spreading fast in the beam of his own flashlight as it dropped to the floor, pointing at the ceiling. "Fall back!" the officer barked, his voice cracking. "Back! Now! Move!" But the cave had already become chaos. Lights swung wildly, beams catching horrifying glimpses of scales, teeth, dripping claws. The floor grew slick under their boots. Someone screamed a name, then fired blind into the dark. One of the creatures leaped from the wall, landing so close the impact shook dust from the ceiling. Another scuttled across the chamber's upper rim, silhouetted against their frantic lights, then vanished again. The survivors broke. They ran. Boots pounded on the wet stone, beams jerking across the walls, cutting only glimpses of what was chasing them. Behind them came the guttural roars, so close now it felt like hot breath on their necks. Another man went down mid-run, tackled into the dark by something too fast to see. His scream ended in a wet gurgle. No one turned back. The officer kept firing over his shoulder, short bursts trying to slow the pursuit. Sparks showered each time bullets bounced, but the creatures didn't slow down. The cave mouth appeared ahead, a pale, beautiful slice of moonlight framed by rock. The remaining men, only 4 of them left, poured toward it, lungs burning, ears filled with the pounding echo of their own retreat. They tumbled out into the night, shouting, weapons still raised, collapsing into the arms of the men at the barricade. The defenders sprang forward, dragging them behind cover, their own barrels aimed into the blackness. But nothing followed. The cave entrance yawned, silent, untouched, as if it had never held anything at all. The soldiers panted, hands shaking, some with blood that was not their own splashed across their fatigues. They barked half-formed orders, tried the radio again, shouted about what they had seen, and then the screams inside the cave stopped, cut clean, as though a switch had been thrown. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. The men at the mouth stared into that dark hole, rifles steady, sweat running down their temples. The cave gave them nothing back. No eyes, no movement, no sound, just silence. And somehow, that silence was worse. The survivors gathered outside the cave, their backs pressed against the cold stone, rifles still trembling in their hands. The disconnect was too much. Inside, a chaotic, lethal nightmare. Outside, a still, quiet night. They shouted over each other, their voices raw with panic. Some were begging for air support, others demanding artillery. "Fire on the mouth!" one man screamed. "Just close it!" Anything to erase what they'd just seen. The radio operator, his face ashen, worked furiously. He cycled frequencies, tapping the handset against his palm as if he could physically beat it into working. For long, agonizing minutes, nothing but static answered. Then, a crackle, a clipped word, and a signal, suddenly strong enough to push through. Unit Bravo, requesting immediate extraction. Multiple casualties. We are... He hesitated, his voice cracking. Hostiles, not human. He didn't repeat the last 2 words. He didn't need to. The officer seized the handset, forcing his own tone into something resembling control. He gave the coordinates, his voice flat. There was no acknowledgement, only silence. At first, the men thought relief had come. They looked up, searching the horizon, hope surging in their chests. A helicopter skimmed low over the ridge, black against the moonlight. It had no markings, no national colors, no identification numbers. It moved quiet, too quiet. The blades made only a heavy, muffled chop, chop, chop. Dust and grit swirled as it dropped into the clearing near the cave, its landing lights off. The side door slid open, and 4 figures stepped out. They weren't dressed like any unit the soldiers knew. They wore black armor, seamless and metallic, that covered them from head to toe. Their visors were smooth, reflective plates of glassy black, giving back nothing. Each one carried a weapon that hummed faintly, its edges sharp and angular. Nothing like the standard-issue rifles of the Mexican army. "Stand down," one of them ordered. The voice was distorted, filtered through a modulator. It was low, mechanical, just human enough to be understood, but not enough to feel natural. The officer stepped forward, demanding identification. "Unit authority, who are you?" No answer was given. The order came again, harder this time, from the modulated voice. "Stand down." The 4 figures moved with an eerie, practiced precision. They didn't glance at the soldiers. They didn't acknowledge their weapons. 2 of them strode straight into the cave mouth, disappearing into the darkness without hesitation. The other 2 remained outside, their visor plates reflecting the starlight, standing perfectly, unnervingly still. From inside the cave, the soldiers heard it again, the screams, but they weren't the same. Not as long this time. They were sharper, more desperate. These were followed by bursts of weapon fire. SX, strange, muffled thumps, zips. A sound unlike any gun they knew. Short, surgical, controlled. The noise cut off in seconds. Then, silence. The 2 operatives emerged, dragging something between them. The first body hit the ground with a heavy, wet thud. It was one of the creatures. Scaled, man-sized, reptilian. The second followed, its chest blown open, thick black fluid leaking into the dust. Even in death, their jaws hung open, teeth bared, claws curled as if ready to strike. The soldiers recoiled. Some crossed themselves, muttering prayers. Others simply stared, their minds refusing to process what was right in front of them. Proof. Undeniable. One of the operatives stepped closer to the officer. The black visor tilted, and the distorted voice spoke with a terrifying mechanical calm. "You saw nothing." The officer started to protest, his voice cracking with anger and fear. "My men." The operative interrupted, its voice flat. "This mission is classified under highest authority. You will say nothing." The operative took 1 step closer. The officer could see his own terrified reflection in the black visor. "We know who you are." The voice continued. "We know your families. Break silence, and you will be disappeared. Do you understand?" The words landed with the weight of a coffin lid. It wasn't a threat shouted in rage. It was an instruction, delivered like an order. Cold, absolute, final. No one answered. They didn't have to. The message was clear. The 4 operatives hauled the 2 massive, scaled bodies back to the helicopter. The ramp closed. Dust kicked up, whipping through the soldiers' hair and stinging their eyes. The chopper lifted straight up into the night. It vanished over the ridge without a signal, without a call sign, without a trace. The men stood alone in the clearing, stunned into silence. The cave yawned behind them, empty again. They had destroyed the plantation. They had followed orders. But what they had seen, the things dragged from the dark, and the men who erased them, would never appear in any report. The night was quiet once more. Too quiet. And the soldiers knew with chilling certainty that the silence wasn't victory. It was control. Back at base, the story was stripped of everything that made it real. The paperwork called it an incident during eradication operations. The language was dry, careful, deliberately thin. Casualties were noted. Equipment was listed as lost. Mission outcome, success. The burned fields were proof enough. Nothing else made it into the file. The surviving soldiers were debriefed, one by one, under harsh fluorescent lights. They sat across from men in clean uniforms who asked questions with blank expressions. and who wrote down only what fit inside the designated lines. Anything outside those lines, the screams, the scales, the oily black eyes, the unmarked helicopter, was met with a cold silence, a long pause, and then the gentle paternal suggestion that fatigue, stress, and the heat can distort memory. The officer pushed, just once. He mentioned what he had seen dragged out of the cave. The man across the table adjusted his glasses, looked down at his report, and said without looking up, "That detail is unnecessary, Captain." The message was the same as the one in the hills, just delivered with a pen instead of a threat. You saw nothing. The unit didn't wait for the next order. Within weeks, the bonds forged in that cave began to fracture. Several of the men resigned their commissions, submitting letters with no explanations beyond personal reasons. Others accepted immediate reassignment, border duty, city patrols, far-flung, forgotten outposts. The group that had entered the cave, the men who had shared that specific, unspeakable terror, was scattered across the map. They were broken up like shards of a glass no one wanted to put back together. Rumors spread in the mess halls, then whispered in bars beyond the base. One soldier had taken his authorized leave and simply never returned. He was found later in a motel room, hundreds of miles away, with no note. Another turned up in a hospital ward after a desperate act. He survived, but he never spoke again. Others were simply said to have checked out. They drifted into silence and shadows, their eyes vacant, until their names were just replaced by new recruits on the roster. The ones who went home didn't leave it behind. They couldn't. Their families saw it first. A wife told her neighbors her husband had started sleeping with the lights on, not just a nightlight, every room glowing until morning. A mother said her son, once the life of the family, wouldn't let the windows stay uncovered. Curtains were pulled tight even in the choking heat of the day. Children learned quickly not to ask. Not to ask why their father jumped at small sudden noises, why he double-locked and then triple-locked all the doors at night, why he always carried something in his pocket, even when he was just mowing the lawn. The nightmares followed them like ghosts. One man woke up his entire house, screaming, swearing he heard the same wail rising up out of the floorboards. Another dreamed, night after night, of being dragged backward into the dark. He would wake only when his wife shook him hard enough to bring him back, his own fingernails digging into his palms. Sleep became an enemy. It was avoided until sheer physical exhaustion forced it. A researcher, a woman named Dr. Dana Morera Salazar, would later collect fragments of their stories. She pieced together their accounts under the strict condition of absolute anonymity. The soldiers who agreed to speak did so carefully. They met in loud public places, cafes, parks. They changed details, dates, and locations to hide themselves. They never used their names. Many of them looked over their shoulders more than once during the conversation. They swore they were being watched, sometimes by unmarked cars parked for too long on their quiet streets, sometimes by men in suits who didn't order coffee in roadside cafes, and sometimes just by the sense of eyes on them, when no one was there at all. On paper, the mission in Guanovado was a success. Fields destroyed, orders carried out. Another small, insignificant victory in the endless war against the cartels. In life, it was different. The soldiers carried silence instead of medals. They carried paranoia instead of pride. They were men who had seen too much, been ordered to speak of nothing, and were left with only their shadows for company. And shadows, as they learned, can follow you everywhere. What happened in Guanovado in 2019 may sound like a modern nightmare. It has all the components: elite soldiers, radio failure, classified files, and unmarked helicopters. But the echoes of this story are far, far older. In Mexico, the idea of creatures that walk half in shadow is not new. The land itself has carried those whispers for centuries. Among the oldest are the legends of the Nahuals. These are the shapeshifters, sorcerers said to be able to shed their human skin and become animals under the cover of night. Some tales paint them as protectors of their villages, others as predators. For generations, farmers spoke of neighbors who could walk the village streets by day. then turn into jaguars or owls when the sun went down. The soldiers' accounts of something moving with unnatural speed, something that climbed walls as if gravity was a suggestion, something that was almost but not quite human. It sounds disturbingly close to what villagers once whispered about the Nahual, that they were people transformed into something scaled or furred, carrying both the cunning of a man and the strength of a beast. Then, there are the serpents of the gods. The Maya called him Kukulkan. The Aztecs knew him as Quetzalcoatl. Carved into the stone of ancient temples and reliefs are endless coils of feathered bodies and reptilian jaws. For scholars, they are mythic teachers, gods of the sky and of knowledge. But for those who live closer to the ruins, who walk the same land, the carvings look less like imagination and more like memory. A reminder that something serpent-shaped once walked among men, something that was honored, feared, and hidden behind the mask of a god. The cries, the wails heard by the soldiers on that first night, call back to another story altogether, La Llorona, the weeping woman. Across Mexico, parents still warn their children not to answer if they hear a woman weeping near the water. The legend says she is a mother searching desperately for the children she drowned, cursed to walk the riverbanks for eternity. Her voice is an omen of tragedy, a sound that crawls under the skin and freezes the blood. The men in the Guanovado hills described wails that seemed female to some, inhuman to others, yet equally mournful and unearthly. To a soldier raised on stories of La Llorona, the sound of a tortured cry drifting from the darkness would not feel like fantasy. It would feel like confirmation. Confirmation that the old stories were still alive. And always, there are the caves. Across Mesoamerica, caves are more than just stone hollows. They are portals. The Olmec, the Maya, the Mexica. All of them saw caves as doorways to the underworld. They were places where gods emerged and where spirits returned. Offerings were left at their mouths. No one entered lightly. To step across the threshold was to cross into a world where the rules bent and where shadows moved on their own. The soldiers didn't just camp in a cave that night. In the ancient language of myth, they trespassed on sacred ground. They stepped into a portal where other, older beings had always lived. Even today, in small towns and rural villages, people warn children not to follow strange cries into the caves, not to answer voices that seem to call from deep underground. The reason is never stated as aliens or monsters. It's older and simpler. Things live there, they say, that are not meant for us. So when those 20 soldiers heard screams in the night and later saw scaled shapes in the dark, their story did not fall on empty ears. It slotted into a framework that was already waiting. Centuries of tales about beings that are part human, part serpent, part shadow. Maybe what they faced in Guanovado was new. Maybe it came from somewhere beyond the stars. Or maybe it was something that had always been here, hiding in the hills, hiding in the caves, remembered only in legend and whispered to children before sleep. One truth remains. The fear the soldiers carried home is the same fear that echoes through Mexico's oldest folklore. A cry in the night that doesn't sound human. A figure in the dark that moves like no man should. And a cave. That feels less like shelter and more like a doorway. The mission is over. The paperwork is filed. But the echoes remain, tying the soldiers in forced silence to legends that stretch back hundreds of years. Guanovado was not the first place to hear those cries, and it will not be the last. Once a story like this goes out into the world, no matter how suppressed, it rarely stays alone. People remember things. They recall moments that didn't fit, fragments of the unexplained they had locked away. They tell them, and those small, quiet confessions begin to add up, forming a pattern. Guanovado is one point on a map. There are others. California Highway, 2016. A man we'll call John was driving south on Interstate 5 late one evening. His passenger suddenly shouted and pointed. On the shoulder, standing under the hard sodium-orange glare of a roadside reflector, was a figure. It was tall, wrapped in a heavy, tattered black robe, despite the California heat. A hood was pulled up, obscuring its face. As they drove past at 70 miles an hour, John says he got a clear look at the face beneath that hood. It was not a human face. He described a flattened snout, greenish, almost wet-looking scales, and big, dark, almond-shaped eyes that caught the light. The three people in the car all saw it. They all agreed on what they'd seen. John, a former military man himself, later filed a civilian report with a paranormal research group. When investigators followed up, they judged him to be sincere, sober, and genuinely disturbed. He told them his only regret was not stopping, not turning back for a photo. The image stayed with him. The guards took their first watch with red-filtered lamps. The dim, crimson light painted their faces in demonic shades, making the sweat on their brows look like blood. They held their rifles at the low ready, scanning the impenetrable blackness beyond the camp. The radio operator, a young specialist, logged the hour in his book. He tried to check in with base, a routine he'd done 1,000 times. He got a hiss that flattened into dead, empty silence. He wrote, Euro 130, no comms, terrain blockage. He kept the handset close, as if its familiar weight was a comfort. That first wail had cut the night in two. The time before it, and the time after. After, the dark felt crowded. It felt like something stood just beyond the feeble ring of their camp, just past the tents, listening. The perimeter men exchanged brief, nervous looks. Their training hammered one thing into them. Hold, don't chase noise. Wait for the unknown to step into the light. It didn't. The cry came again. Longer this time, much closer. It rose in pitch until it broke, shattering the night like a sheet of torn metal. The sound didn't travel the way sound should. It seemed to curve around the trees, as if it were being pulled by the stone of the ridges themselves. A guard on the north sector lifted a hand, palm out. Everyone froze. Somewhere past the dry creek, brush shifted, just once. A heavy crunch, then stop. There were no footsteps, no voices, just the undeniable sense of weight moving in the dark. The commanding officer kept his voice impossibly low, a sharp whisper that cut through the tension. No flashlights unless contact, no shots unless you are fired upon. He moved along the line, a steady metronome in a place where time itself felt warped and broken. Minutes stretched. Breathing became too loud. Eyelids burned, the men desperate not to blink. Silence returned. But this was a different kind. It felt thick, manufactured. A younger soldier, his face slick with cold sweat, started counting in his head to keep from shaking. 60, 120, 300. He lost track. The forest gave them nothing but their own pulse. At 02:14, the radio coughed, a sharp crackle, a clipped electronic syllable, then a sharp pop, like a cable being yanked from a socket. The operator frantically tuned the dials up and down, found a clean seam in the noise for half a second, and lost it. He didn't write down what he felt, that the interference wasn't terrain. It felt aimed. On the south edge, a sentry heard breathing. It was wet, close to the ground, and it was not an animal. He could feel the difference. He eased one step forward, his boot making no sound, careful not to snap a twig. The breathing stopped. He held still. It started again, behind him. He spun, his rifle sight slapping up against his eye, framing, blackness. Nothing there. Just the empty space where he had been standing. He stepped back into his own footprints, his heart hammering his ribs. He didn't move again. At 03:02, the wails split into more than one voice. 2, maybe 3. They weren't calling together. They were answering each other, a complex call and response that echoed across the trees with no perceptible delay. Human voices carry edges, pleading, panic, hesitation. These carried none. They were clean, empty. They were purpose without emotion. "Hold for light," the officer said. It was the only correct decision on paper. It also turned the remaining hours until dawn into an agonizing test of will. Every tiny sound felt like a trap, one that would spring if someone so much as breathed wrong. A smell crept in around 03:30. It wasn't vegetation. It wasn't decay. It was damp stone and old copper. The medic checked their small stove and fuel containers. Nothing was leaking. The air itself carried it. He tasted metal at the back of his tongue and swallowed, hard. The man with the photo slid it out of his pocket. His thumb rested on the edge of the plastic. He put it back without looking at it. A different soldier, one who hadn't been to church in years, ran a silent loop of prayers he'd learned as a child. The radio operator tried one more call at 0407. He got a single clipped word. Check. Then the line died again. He logged the time, his hand shaking just once. First light came thin and gray. The screams ended as if a switch had been thrown. Birds should have started their morning song. They didn't. No insects, no wind. Just the small dry sounds of the camp. A zipper, a canteen cap, a throat clearing that made 3 men flinch. Coffee. Eat. We move in 20. The officer said, his voice perfectly even. The simple rhythm of the order steadied them. They broke camp without a word. Packs up, lines checked. A last look into the trees where the noise had lived. Nothing moved. They filed onto the goat path. Single file. Rifles quiet. Boots marked the dust. The radios stayed dead. The forest watched, and it said nothing. By the time the sun had cleared the ridge, they had all agreed without needing to speak. Whatever had cried in the dark was still out there. It hadn't shown itself. It hadn't chased. It had only told them one thing, clearly and patiently. It knew they were here. It's a small, plain testimony. A driver, a roadside figure, a face that did not belong to any animal he knew. Essex, United Kingdom, 2005. A different kind of sighting came from a garden in Essex. A man stepped outside late at night to put out his trash, and he froze. Up in a large oak tree at the edge of his property, something tall was watching him. He described it as being taller than a man, standing upright on a thick branch. Its skin, in the faint moonlight, looked like thick, rough, reptile hide. When he stared, the creature did something that made his blood run cold. It shifted color. It blended, its skin tones changing to match the leaves and the bark of the tree until it seemed to vanish, becoming just another part of the foliage. He backed away slowly. He left his trash, went inside, and locked the door. A decade earlier, in nearby Somerset, a woman named Margaret reported a brief but similar encounter with a small, blue-tinged figure she saw clinging to an oak. She felt a wordless exchange, not hate. She described it as curiosity and almost embarrassment, and then it was gone. Both accounts, from 2 different people in 2 different decades, share a detail that matters. These beings can hide in plain sight. They can change color. They can step out of the background and then step right back in. It makes you wonder, what did the soldiers in Guanovado miss? When they looked at the cave wall, did they see rock? Right up until the moment it wasn't rock anymore. Yucatan, Mexico. 1957. Longer ago, in 1957, a Mayan boy named Chaktuk told a different sort of story. He and several others in his village saw a bright ball of light drop into the jungle. They went searching, expecting to find a crashed plane. They found not a crash site, but 2 red eyes, glowing above them in the trees. The thing that leaped down was described as large, powerful, and frog-like in its skin. After that night, the searchers, all of them, fell ill for weeks with high fevers and painful rashes. It was a physical toll that turned the sighting from a strange memory into a permanent warning. Whether that sickness was a coincidence or a consequence is still debated. The memory stays, locked in local oral records. Elders still tell it as a warning. What do these small echoes share? Look at these 3 reports, side by side with the Guanovado incident, and certain lines stand out. Witnesses often talk about the silence around the sighting, an absence of birds or insects, a hush that feels deliberate. Several describe a smell, damp stone, metal, something like old copper. The beings often appear without a clear approach. One moment, there is nothing. The next, a figure is standing in the open. They vanish just as oddly. A color shift, a slide into the shadows, a leap, and then gone. And when the encounter is close and physical, witnesses sometimes report sudden illness or long-lasting psychological trauma. None of these accounts proves the Guanovado story. None of them belongs to the same night or the same place. But together, they sketch a shape, Scattered reports from different decades, different cultures, and different climates that all echo one another in small but important ways. Roadside robes in California, color-shifting figures in Essex, red eyes in a Mayan jungle. They are separate points of light that suggest a wider and much more unsettling constellation. So the map widens. Guanovado stops being a single strange dot and becomes part of a larger, deeply disturbing pattern. If these accounts are honest, and most of the witnesses interviewed by researchers came across as steady, sober, and unwilling to dramatize, then whatever the soldiers found in that cave might not be unique. The question grows: how many places carry that hush, that smell, that vanishing act? How many small quiet moments are waiting for someone to notice? And if Guanovado is only one echo, where exactly does the sound come from? Bravery has many faces. Some of it lives in medals and reports, the kind that gets read aloud at ceremonies while men stand at attention. But there is another kind of bravery, the kind that never leaves the shadows, the kind that lives in the quiet, desperate moments after the trauma, where no one applauds and nothing is written down. That is the kind the survivors of Guanovado carried home. One man, the soldier who had carried the photo of his wife and daughter, sat at a metal desk in his barracks weeks later. He propped that same photo against his rifle butt. He took out a scrap of paper and began a letter he never intended to send. He wrote to his daughter. He told her that the mountains had voices. He told her that if she ever heard a cry in the night, a cry that made her bones ache and her teeth hurt, she should not answer it. He told her to go inside, to lock the door, and to turn on the lights. He folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into the back of his body armor. It stayed there, like a hidden wound, carried through each subsequent assignment. The edges curled, the ink blurred with sweat. Another soldier never wrote a word. His ritual became prayer, though he confessed to Dr. Salazar that he no longer believed much in God. Not after that night. Every night, lying in his bunk, or later, in his bed at home, he counted his breaths. 4 seconds in, hold for 4, 4 seconds out, hold for 4. On the 5th breath, he pictured the cave mouth. He pictured it closing, stone grinding against stone, sealing the darkness inside. On the 6th breath, he begged for silence. Not with words, but with a desperate, crushing weight of thought. When sleep finally came, it didn't come as rest. It came as a fall. A third man built habits he could never explain. Habits that drove his family crazy. He stacked books against the latch of his bedroom window. He left the bathroom light on every single night, though he told his wife it was in case the children got up. He checked the locks on the front door 3 times before lying down. Then, when the house was quiet and he was sure she was asleep, he would get up and check them again. The nightmares were common ground. Men woke choking on screams, swearing they'd heard claws on stone, or that low, guttural wail coming from inside their own walls. One dreamed over and over of being pulled backward into the dark, his boots sliding on the slick floor. He would wake only when his bunkmate, or later his wife, shook him hard enough to break the spell. Another swore that he could still smell it, that faint, metallic tang of copper and damp stone. He swore he could smell it whenever it rained. Paranoia settled in as quietly as dust. Rear-view mirrors got checked twice, then 3 times. A van, parked too long on the street, made one man stay awake all night, sitting in his dark living room, his hand near a pistol he wasn't supposed to keep at home. Conversation stopped, mid-sentence, when a stranger sat too close in a cafe. The sense of being watched never left them, and in some ways they were right. The creatures in the cave had been real. They were a nightmare of claws and teeth. That much was certain. But what followed, what came in the black helicopter, was worse. Because the creatures were a physical threat. You could fight them, and you could run from them. The silence that came after. The men with the black visors and the cold mechanical voices. That threat had no shape at all. It was a threat to their families, a threat to their very existence, and it hollowed them out more completely and more permanently than anything they had faced in that cave. The monsters were terrifying. The cover-up was absolute. Caves are thresholds. They look like empty rooms, carved by water and time, but they behave like doors. Step across the mouth, and the world's rules begin to loosen. Sound bends, air grows old, time stretches. Jungles too have their own rules. They do their own listening. The leaves hide things. Silence in a jungle is not absence, it's attention. The soldiers in Guanovado walked through both, leaf and stone, path and mouth. They went in to burn fields. They came out carrying questions that no official report could ever hold. The cave gave them a lesson their training had never covered. Sometimes the threat isn't on the map. Sometimes it's beneath it. And if it happened there, why only there? Mexico is a land full of openings. Grutas, cenotes, old mines, punched deep into the hills. Some are mapped, most are not. Across the world, forests and rock do the same quiet work. They keep secrets. They wait. They choose their witnesses. So the question lingers, like a cold draft from an unseen tunnel, deep underground. What else is waiting? Is that hush you feel when you're on a night hike and the crickets suddenly stop? Is that just the weather? Or is it a held breath? Are those echoes you hear in the hills only your echoes? Or is something answering back from a place your light can't reach? The men who went inside that cave can't tell you, or they won't. Their silence is paperwork. It's pressure. It's the cold, absolute threat against their families. It's a lid, fitted tight. But stories find seams. They leak. They collect in corners. They gather in the dark until someone is finally brave enough or foolish enough to say, "Listen. Listen. If you were at that cave mouth, if the screams of your comrades lifted out of the dark and pulled at your bones, what would you have done? Would you have gone in with the team? Or would you have stayed outside and held the line? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to know which choice you'd make when the rules blur and the dark starts to speak. If this story stayed with you, if it made you recheck a shadow, or listen just a little harder to a quiet field, stay with us. Subscribe. There are more field reports, more testimonies, more places where the earth opens up, and something old looks back. Stories like this aren't finished. They keep walking just beside the road. They keep standing just at the tree line. And they keep breathing just under the stone. We'll follow them carefully. With the light we have,